Hi, I'm Naveena, living on light still. This is the 10th day. It's the 13th of May, and I'm feeling hale and hearty, no problem. Lost 15 pounds. I could well use losing 15 pounds. So there's not a lot to say yet. We don't have a live stream. We're just having a hard time with that. It might, I don't know what we're going to do about it. We need like $6,000 or $7,000 to get the camera, so we'll just have to wait for that. But what I thought I'd do, I said I was going to shamelessly promote my books. So what I'm going to do is read one chapter from each of the books, first chapter. So the first book I'm going to read to you was actually the last book I wrote, and that was started in about, I think, 1993. And it's called The New Magic. It's up on Amazon. It has a different cover on Amazon. But there it is. The New Magic by Naveena Shine. I really love fantasy fiction. I love Tolkien. And so when I had written the other 3 books, I thought, oh no, what do I want to write about? So fantasy fiction. Okay, let's just see if I can do one like that. I put them up on the internet in 2001 when I found a publisher on demand, eBookstand. You can find the hard copy at eBookstand. But you know what? I never promoted it. I never talked about it. I never, I had a handful of people buy it. In fact, I think I was the only one who bought them and sold them to my friends at cost price, So I'm not a salesperson. So, but I love these stories. I mean, I love the themes. And always the theme for me is about what's going on in the unconscious mind. How does this person become the person that they are? And so even though there's this story of the quest and wizards and things like that, it's really looking at what drives these people, what drives their actions. The first chapter actually talks a lot about the hero's underground stuff that's going on that he doesn't know about. But let me just read it. Okay. So, this is chapter 1 of The New Magic by Naveena Shine. I'm going to stop halfway through the chapter and do a second YouTube because this will take too long for a YouTube. It takes far too long to download. So, page 7 I'm going to stop and... Okay, chapter 1. No, Rindon, no. How many times have I told you? You must never use high magic for such ridiculous purposes. Rindon cursed under his breath as Lycad's words burst through his concentration, releasing the 3 young apprentices from their frozen bondage. Angry at being made sport of, they turned towards Lycad to protest their treatment. Shaking his head with impatience, Lycad ordered shortly, "Go, no harm is done." The boys shuffled away, stifling their indignation, and were pleased to hear the stern voice of the wizard ring out, "Rindon, you stay here, boy. I have not finished with you." Rindon bowed his head in an attitude of humbleness, as was the custom, and awaited the anticipated reprimand. As the seconds slipped by, with no sound of any chastisement, his discomfort grew. Finally, unable to contain himself another moment, Rindon raised his eyes and looked sharply into the master's face. In the rugged, ancient features, he was surprised to find only weary puzzlement, where there had previously been anger. "Rindon," sighed Lycad heavily, "why, you were chosen defeats all the wisdom of my experience. Such an arrogant, disobedient, power-crazy apprentice I have never had. Were you anyone else, You would have been dismissed from this school well before your first month was out. Yet here you are, 5 years later, the day before your 18th birthday, soon to be initiated into the highest order of sorcery, and you're still as willful and as unruly as ever. Lycat closed his eyes with a shudder, and wondered for the 1000th time what it was about this boy that singled him out as being so special. Why on earth had he been chosen to fulfill a destiny so clearly foreseen and so close upon them? But there could be no mistake. Legends of old had described the exact sign, a crescent moon pierced by the winged staff of freedom, wisdom. It was a mark that had been there from birth, marring the smooth fairness on his left shoulder. The school of wizards had searched far and wide for this child, who was to be the hope of the earth, becoming more desperate as the years passed by and the evil grew stronger. Then they had found him, almost 5 years ago, eking out an existence by the seashore, catching fish, tracking small animals, shunned by and shunning all humankind. A sadder, angrier, more lonely child Lycat had never seen. But the mark was there, and he had to be trained. So they brought him to Torren, where stood the great wizard school. Here young hopefuls were trained, carefully prepared for the task of keeping the high magic alive throughout the earth, and protecting it from all forms of evil. As he thought of the terrible peril that was even now making itself felt throughout the human kingdoms, Lycat sternly brought himself back to the present and looked archly at young Rindon. "Well, boy, you better go now and get yourself ready for tonight's ceremony, and mind you're not late." Rindon bowed a second time, immensely relieved that he had gotten off so lightly. With a secret smile playing on his lips, he turned towards the wing of the castle that housed the young apprentices. Walking with that smooth flowing gait that all wizards learned, his long white robe undulated almost imperceptibly as he controlled the urge to run. With just a hint of defiance, he flung open the doors of his lodgings and glided arrogantly through. Laughing now, Rindon ran to the small room which he shared with 3 other boys. On entering, he was relieved to find that the room was empty. He didn't want to spend the last few hours of his apprenticeship in idle play or chatter. He wanted to savor every moment of the change, feeling the difference as the ancient words of incantation invoked the power that was soon to be coursing through his veins. He longed for that moment when he would be regarded as the greatest wizard ever to have walked the earth. Oh yes, he knew of the prophecy. Over the past 5 years, it seemed he had heard of nothing else. How he was to save the world in its time of greatest need, how his powers of sorcery were to be pitted against the terror that was even now weaving its web through the very fabric of the earth, turning all things it touched into a mirror of its own evil. Rindon revelled at the thought. How glorious it would be! What power he would have! The one thing he wanted in life was to have power. More than anything else, he craved power. Never again would anyone dare to hurt him, dare to humiliate him. Nobody again would be able to tell him what he should and should not do. The muscles around his heart tightened as he remembered how the village people had treated him during those early years long ago. It had made them anxious when he seemed to be a little different from the rest of the children. They couldn't understand if he anticipated things a bit better than they, almost as if he knew what was about to happen. At first, he thought it was fun to use his strange knowledge in his games with the other boys and girls. But gradually, they grew angry and then afraid. Finally, they wouldn't even let him play with them. The adults soon recognized that something was not quite right. In their ignorance, they became wary of him and would not allow their children to have any contact with him. Soon it became apparent that if someone's cow died, or the crops were poor, or someone suffered a snake bite, there was only one person to whom all this harm could be attributed. Even his own father and mother had stood by in silent agreement as he had been beaten, stoned, and driven from the village to survive or die as he might. Terrified, uncomprehending, and miserable, he had walked for days, collapsing each night to lie cold, hungry, and exhausted until the sun shone to warm him again. Hunger drove him on. He gobbled down the few nuts and berries he could find among the trees. Eventually, he reached the seashore. Confronted with such a mass of water, he could go no further. Then he had sat and contemplated his misery. The pain of rejection hurt him deeply, and people's fear of him puzzled him. At 10 years old, he could think of no reason why anyone should hate him so much they should want to be rid of him. He had never hurt anyone in his life, and they had done this to him. Fear and helplessness turned to self-pity, which in time turned to anger. With no one to vent his rage upon, it smouldered within and became like a cloud surrounding him. It was thus, 3 years later, that the wizards had found him and informed him of his destiny. A light began to shine in his life. He would now show them that they were wrong. He would never allow himself to be the terrified little boy again. They would have to look up to him and respect him. It was they who would be terrified of him. Already, even before his initiation, he had shown powers that had startled even the eldest wizards, and he was sure he had caught a look of apprehension in their faces as they had watched him in his training. All that talk about service and humility had not meant much to him. Pride and arrogance protected him from having to feel what was still the underlying fear of his life. Deep down, he was terrified of being helpless. He would not have admitted it, nor was he even aware of it. Yet somewhere within, he was appalled by the possibility of its happening once more. Its avoidance was his sole motivation. The only way he knew to prevent the calamity of being helpless was to have power. Once he was powerful, he would be able to order the universe according to his own wishes. He walked to the bathing room and climbed into the refreshingly cool waters. Whistling softly to himself, he allowed the excitement to ripple through his body, relishing the vibrations he could feel through each muscle and sinew. At 18, he knew that he was at the peak of his physical prowess. The wizards did not neglect the training of the body in their endeavours for mastery of the mind. Every day the apprentices had to face endurance tests, trials of skill and strength. This was so that when the time came, their bodies would be suitable receptacles to hold and contain the tremendous surge of energy that their wizardry would give them. Rindon surveyed his muscular form with pride and knew that if a feat was physically possible, he would be able to perform it. The next part will be in the next YouTube